when wrestling was Rasslin, covering the history of the Houston wrestling scene from Whiskers Savage to Wahoo McDaniel. Please welcome wrestling author Peter Birkholz. Peter, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Steve.
Yes, and you're not just an author, you are also somebody who's worked in the business, and you are the nephew, if I remember correctly from the book, of the legendary Paul Boesch.
Yes, I was a nephew of Paul Boesch, and I grew up in a wrestling family, and I obviously grew up in the family-run Houston wrestling promotion. So from age 5 all the way through to my retirement, I had the pleasure of working with some of the finest people in professional wrestling.
Yes, and you tell a lot of stories about that in the book, including the time you wrestled a bear. But it's also interesting to me that the book, I could actually say, is split into two halves. There's a half that's about your involvement in Houston wrestling, and then there's the half before you came into the business as a youngster. There's like the Morris Siegel era in the first half of the book, as I would call it.
Yes, that's correct. And what I was trying to do, Steve, and what the whole effort and objective with this book, when wrestling was Rasslin, is that I wanted to help try to preserve that golden era of professional wrestling, the golden era of the territorial promotions. As you know, that went away a couple of decades ago with Vince McMahon and the WWE going nationwide, and it changed the business. But to me, the finest era of professional wrestling was those decades where the territorial promotions ruled the business, and I just felt like I wanted to do what I could to try to help preserve that, because it did feature some great wrestling stars, but also I think any of the readers who read this book, they're going to get a really good feel of what a territorial regional promotion was all about, and that was one of the main goals.
I'd say that the book does a tremendous, fantastic job of doing that, because you see the birth of Houston wrestling going all the way back. You take it to the Hackenschmidt Gotch match. You give people that grounding and the foundation of what professional wrestling is in North America, and then you go forward from there. You tell the story of the city auditorium being built and the first wrestling shows being promoted there. And you can see that Houston established a foothold very early on as a territory that would be a hotbed for wrestling for decades to come.
And it was, and that's what was so having such a big advantage being in the Houston wrestling promotion, because even back in the 30s and 40s, it was a hotbed and a market that really helped establish some superstars. Vern Gagne had already started wrestling, but he really didn't get his big push until he came down to the Houston wrestling. Then, of course, we had the famous Gorgeous George, who grew up in Houston and got involved in the professional wrestling business. And one story after another, and that's what I think what made Houston wrestling such a legendary promotion and such an important one for wrestling fans of not only yesteryear and of today, but I think in the future, Steve, I think it's going to be important for wrestling fans to know a little bit about the initial start of the business. And again, I keep reiterating the regional promotions, because that was the backbone of the business at that time.
And there's a lot of great facts in there. I learned some things that I didn't know. For example, I knew the legend of Gorgeous George, but until I read your book, I didn't realize that he was actually born in Nebraska. I didn't realize he was a fellow Nebraskan that was born in Butte, and I learned that from your book.
Well, yes, but of course, getting it started in Houston, it's funny with the folklore about how he would literally, as a young man, would stand on the corner and challenge anybody to wrestle him, and for the winner to get 25 cents. And it didn't take long for a wrestling promoter, Morris Siegel, to find out about him and brought him into the business. But Steve, it's a remarkable story of how he quickly developed that character of Gorgeous George, and you could watch it through the 40s, not only in the Houston market, but of course when he went out to the West Coast and was a big sensation out there as well.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you point out in the book that television played a big part in that, because he started out as just your average-looking, brown-haired pro wrestling type, and then once TV came along, he got more and more flamboyant, and he started wearing the extravagant rings and having people follow him around with perfume, and how wrestling just became a spectacle thanks to the television broadcasts of the 50s.
Well, Gorgeous George was in the right spot at the right time. He developed that gimmick just in time, and of course, for national television, he was a big, big hit. In fact, I've read in several sources that when they listed the top 100 events in the entire history of television, that the debut of Gorgeous George was one of them, and I think that's a big tribute to the talent and skills that he had.
I've talked to Dave Meltzer about him before, and he said that during his heyday, he was, legitimately one of the best earning sports athletes in the country. That what he made back in those days would be comparable to what $1 million NBA and NFL players make these days.
Yeah, I think relatively speaking, it would be. And you got to remember back then that wrestlers got paid in cash. With the superstars of today, they get paid all these lucrative annuities and long-term contracts. But he did extremely well, and he did work very hard at it.
Mm. And as a consequence, the people who used him also did extremely well. Houston Wrestling did very well. Morris Siegel did very well. And it's just fun to go back and see those days that were from before my time, but be able to see them both from your historical analysis of them, and then as the book transitions from your own perspective, growing up as a little kid and always being around this business. And that is a tremendous life story, to have your uncle and your father and everybody be involved in around the wrestling business and just grow up with it like these wrestlers are more or less your family.
Yes, it was that way, and it was very unique, and I was very fortunate to be involved in a wrestling family and then be involved in youth wrestling promotion. But Steve, as you're doing such a great job pointing out, I think that's what the main appeal is going to be of this book for wrestling fans of today and in the future, and even those from that can remember back in the days when wrestling was wrestling. Is that I worked hard at trying to show that inside perspective and that I try to preserve for future wrestling fans what it was like back then. And you're exactly right. When you use the term family, when you take a look at all the different family promotions back then, of course you had the Siegels and the Bosches and the Birkholzes in Houston, but you had the Von Erichs and you had in Dallas, Fort Worth, and you had the Grahams in Florida, and you had the Crockett's on the East Coast, and of course the famous McMahon family, the several generations up in the Northeast, and you go on. And I really think that's an element that was so key back then in the success of professional wrestling. It was a family business, whether in the promoter's office or in the wrestling ring. Everybody worked together. There was this all-out effort to work together to make the business successful and everybody to make money.
Now, speaking of family stories, one of the ones that really got my attention reading the book was when you were working basically as a runner and a production assistant, and you had a run-in with Fritz Von Erich. You were supposed to wrangle him for an interview, and it turned out to be a very shocking event because nobody had wised you up to what he was going to do.
No, they didn't, and I wish they would have, looking back at it, but as being an 11-year-old running back forward. I just remember that night. That was my first night as official television director for the Houston Wrestling Television Show, that my uncle, Paul Bosch, stressed to me several times, no matter what happens, Pete, you stay out of it. As if an 11-year-old boy is going to do anything against Fritz Von Erich anyway. I think that was the way my uncle was trying to prepare me that, hey, there's going to be some things happening tonight. You just stand back, and someday you'll understand. And later on, I did understand. It was quite a shock to me that night. But as I pointed out in the book, Steve, strangely enough, I was hooked. That night, I was scared to death, but deep down inside, I was hooked for good. I wanted a career in professional wrestling.
Now, obviously, the fans that night, you were hooked by the excitement of it, even if it was a little terrifying. And the fans were hooked in because they wanted to see how there was going to be revenge after the dastardly actions of Fritz Von Erich. And I got to draw an analogy between, actions, heelish actions back then and heelish actions today, because a lot of people say that CM Punk went too far with the urn and the Undertaker on Raw this week. But in many ways, that angle is kind of a throwback to the territorial days when wrestlers used to do the most dastardly things possible just to rile up a crowd.
Yes, it was. And of course, as the years progress, you have to get a little bit more, bizarre and a little bit more outlandish with it, because but back then, you're right, relatively speaking, we had television was live at the time when Fritz Von Erich made his debut, and we actually went off the air, Steve, with him having the iron claw and my uncle bleeding and screaming in pain, and it just so happened that it timed everything just right that we went off the air with that, and you would not believe the response on radio and newspaper and so forth on the following week, as wrestling fans were demanding to know what happened, after it went off the air. So it's all part of the business, and it was all part of what how people back then how promotions made money.
Indeed, and Houston wrestling made a lot of money over the years. It was for a long time one of the biggest promotions in the country, and as you said in the book, it launched many careers, both in the era before you came along and the era since. But as the transition point, I have to wonder, when you saw Fritz doing that to your father at that time, did it ever occur to you that his sons would go on to be like legends of Texas wrestling and become the superstars that they were?
Well, at that particular moment, it didn't. But as I continued to work Houston wrestling and watched the career of Fritz Von Erich and his development of the booking office, and of course, even at a younger age, before they even started wrestling, I would be bumping into the various Von Erich boys in different wrestling towns. But I can tell you from the very get-go, Steve, that they were tremendous athletes, and Fritz Von Erich was a very demanding father. In fact, when you were a top star and you were booked in his booking office, one of the things that sometimes you had to do is go out to their ranch and work out with his sons. So his sons got tremendous training and support, and of course Fritz was behind them, giving them a big push as well. And it's just a shame that what's happened to many of his sons, because they were very gifted athletes. I mean, even Kerry Von Erich, when he got a track scholarship for University of Houston, he was wrestling on the side, but he was very good at the discus throw, and he could have very well represented the United States in the upcoming Olympics that year. But Kerry chose to go ahead and go into professional wrestling, and then also his brothers David and so forth were all-state basketball, and some of them were all-state football. So what an athletic family the Von Erich family was.
Yes, and unfortunately, what a tragedy it turned out to be when one after another had an unfortunate fate in the wrestling business. And I think some people actually call it the Von Erich curse, because it just seemed that one by one, there was just no getting around it. That family, there was a black cloud hanging over them.
Well, unfortunately, that was the case, and I'm not a big believer in curses, but they did have more than their fair share of bad luck, and it's a shame, because knowing them personally, they were very good people, and as you said, it's tragically it's just some of those final endings to their lives, and I still to this day wonder what could have happened if all that could have been avoided, if all those sons could have stayed in the athletic world, just what they could have accomplished.
Mm-hmm. And even the ones that survived a little bit longer and made it to the WWF, there was tragedies there too, like Kerry with his motorcycle accident and losing part of his foot. It's like, how much more of a star could he have been without that accident, and how far could he have gone in the WWF at the time if it weren't for that? It's hard to know. You can always ask those what if questions, but there are never good answers.
Right.
So I want to go back to a story in the book before I give Peter a chance to ask a few questions as well. And it's a tremendous story from the book of you wrestling a bear. And you kind of got, no pun intended, thrown to the wolves, because nobody told you were going to be doing this. And they sent you out to the ring. And you had to find out the secret before you got in the ring of how to not get killed by this bear.
It was, at the time, I wasn't too amused. I was just, I think, not even quite 18 years old. And as I pointed out the story, we had closed the wrestling ticket office, and anybody who knew my uncle, Paul Bosch, knew that he was an old-time, old-school promoter, Steve. He would do anything to sell tickets. So we jumped in the car and went out to at the time was the boat show at the Astro Hall right next to the Astrodome here in Houston. And Nick Adams was putting on a exhibition with his wrestling bear. And we got there to plug the tickets for the next night, Friday night. We were going to have the wrestling bear at the Sam Houston Coliseum. So we were there to sell some tickets, and Nick Adams thought it would be a good idea if I got up there and wrestled the bear. And I tell you, there was a few moments there before I got up there that I really, really did not like the idea at all. And as I was going up the steps to face the bear, Nick Adams was kind enough to tell me the secret. And I'll let readers wait until they read the book and find out what the secret was. And when I learned the secret, I actually got up there and we wrestled the bear, and the bear and I put on a great show. And look back at it, it was a fun event. And what was really interesting, Steve, is that when after I had wrestled the bear, Nick Adams opened it up to the public, offering $1,000 to anybody can beat the bear. I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'8" and 170 pounds, and all these big guys from the crowd thought, well, if that small guy can handle that bear, then I surely can win $1,000. But as I point out in the book, Nick Adams didn't tell them the secret. So they ran up there and they attacked the bear with all their might, and they got knocked on their rear ends. And it was just, I wish I had videotape of it, because it was just these big, huge guys would be staggering away from the bear, looking at me like, how in the hell did you do all that? Well, I knew the secret.
Yes, you did. They did. They suffered for it. But Peter, I want to give you a chance to ask Peter a question. So my co-host from Ottawa is going to tag in, and Peter, go ahead.
Well, being up here in Ottawa, my knowledge of Houston wrestling, I'll admit, isn't very good. So most of my knowledge has to come from tapes and from books. My first question is this book going to be available up here in Canada?
Well, my understanding it is. It's available on Amazon.com, and it's also available in the Kindle version. And my understanding, according to my editors, is that those wrestling fans in Canada still they can order the book on Amazon.com through, I think, what they call the Canadian market of Amazon.com. But we have a website called When Wrestling Was Rasslin, RASSLIN.com. When Wrestling Was Rasslin.com. And, Peter, they can get onto that website, and it gives them additional information on how to get the book. And it's fun, because when I get the reports and I see books are being purchased around the world, including Canada, Japan, and Europe, and Australia, and Great Britain, it's encouraging to know that, you know what, there's maybe we're able to preserve some of the magic of the Houston wrestling promotion, because there was a certain amount of magic to it.
Now, is there anywhere, like, if I wanted to pick up a tape of Houston wrestling, is there any tapes available?
Well, at this moment, the Houston Wrestling Library that I started with Paul Bosch back in the late 70s of wrestling action on our wrestling television show, it's tied up in different legalities. And as an owner and a producer and one of the television announcers on it, I'm in a position now that I would welcome the opportunity to talk with the other parties involved and try to work something out, because to me that's important, because that's part of the history of professional wrestling, and I would like to see wrestling fans have access to it, but I would also like to see it preserved in the future, because this era that I loved and I was a participant in, it's gone. Most of the wrestlers are gone. Most of the promoters are gone. A lot of the fans are gone. And I just wanted to do whatever I can, and I appreciate opportunities like this with you and Steve we work together to try to preserve it. It's a part of the professional wrestling history that I would like to see preserved, and for fans for today and in the future, be able to pick up this book and read about what it was like in the days of Lou Thesz and Gorgeous George and Wahoo McDaniels and so many of the other top stars.
Now, I'm on the website right now. There's some really great photos on here. André the Giant, some big names, Ted DiBiase. I love the picture with the Betacam video camera. That's making me laugh right now. But is there, if I was to, let me rephrase that. Is there someone that I would find, or the casual fan, is there someone that would be surprised to hear that they actually made a stopover in Houston wrestling? Is there like a big name where it was like, wow, he wrestled in Houston too? Well,
there's so many of them, and I think it's not only that they stopped over here, Peter, is that the fact is that many of them got their big push. As I mentioned before, like Vern Gagne, he was a tremendous wrestling star, but he had not really gotten into a major market and gotten a big push. Then you got Buddy Rogers. Years ago, when Buddy Rogers showed up in Houston, he wasn't Buddy Rogers. He walked into the office at Morris Siegel, and Morris Siegel had seen a movie the week before starring Buck Rogers. He looked up at Buddy and says, "You're now Buddy Rogers." And the two of them created a tremendous gimmick and a character that Buddy took it to the hilt. In fact, he was the first one to ever hold the world title belt in two major wrestling associations. Antonio Rocca was brought into this country by Morris Siegel. And when he brought him into Houston wrestling, all of a sudden the promoters up in the Northeast offered Antonio Rocca more money, and he jumped ship and went to the Northeast. But so many of the stars either got their start in Houston wrestling or a major push that took them to the next level. And I really think that's one of the things that make the Houston wrestling promotion so unique in comparison to other regional promotions of the time, is that it just seemed to have a certain element of magic to it. And I think a lot of that had to do with hard work by Morris Siegel, and then just the atmosphere. We had a tremendous television show that was being aired live from the Coliseum during the live matches. So if you were a wrestler back then, Peter, you came to Houston, you not only gained valuable experience inside the ring, but all of a sudden you were getting experience on television, because we were one of the first to do live television interviews in front of the crowd. And that's an art that the WWE has taken to a whole new level. But that you would come into this town, and you'd come into this market, and you'd come out a very polished veteran.
Yeah, I think the only territories up where I am is the old Montreal territory and the old Toronto territory back in the day.
Yeah.
We do have a question from the chat room, and that is from Quintastic, and he writes, of anybody currently actively wrestling in the WWE, who would stand the best chance of making a name for themselves back in the territory days of wrestling?
Oh, man, there's such a long list because the WWE has some fantastic talent. I don't keep up with wrestling as much as I used to, obviously, but it's when you take a look at the Undertaker. The Undertaker grew up in Houston, watching Paul Bosch and I in Houston wrestling. And he's done, and then you have individuals like The Rock. Well, The Rock's father, Rocky Johnson, and his grandfather, Chief Peter Maivia, worked for Paul and I here in Houston. There's so many of them, and Triple H and all the tremendous athletes and great personalities and characters portrayed on television. So there's quite a few. I think the big difference is that back then you developed basically your own character. You were your own businessman. You had to market yourself inside and outside the ring. And of course now, in my understanding of WWE, they have a huge staff and organization that does a lot of that, working with the athletes. But back in the days of Gorgeous George and so forth, you were your own businessman. You cut your own deals. You did your own marketing. And what I thought was really interesting is that when you knew that you were going to be on television, no one told you what to say. No one told you what to wear. You did it yourself. You knew the gimmick. You knew the story that you wanted to get across to the wrestling fans. So it was not more individual effort. But to answer your question, there's quite a few stars today that could do well back in the days of the territories.
Yeah, I actually view CM Punk as being one of those guys because he is what you described as the guy who goes out there and promotes himself and says what he wants and doesn't have a script. He's one of those guys that I think would have thrived in the Houston territory because he really does know how to go out there and sell himself and sell wrestling to the public. And he always calls it wrestling. He refuses to call it sports entertainment, which is as close to Rasslin, I suppose, as we get these days.
I agree with you on that, and I'm like you. I think it's very interesting not only to watch these individuals perform in the ring, but how do they market themselves outside the ring? To me, it's such a fascinating combination. And back in the days that I write about when wrestling was wrestling, it was that more fell on their shoulders. I mean, it's their job, and as they traveled these hundreds of miles in between towns by car and so forth. I tell you, you would enjoy riding in the carload of wrestlers. When you go 300 to 400, 500 miles to the next town, you never turned on the radio. There was enough wrestling stories and folklore in that car to keep you entertained the whole trip. And I miss those days because that, especially when you had individuals like Bronco Lubitsch. Bronco Lubitsch could tell a story, and I used to love traveling with him because he was very entertaining. But it was, to me, interesting to see the combination, how an athlete can perform in the ring and at the same time have the business savvy and the feel for the wrestling fan to know how to promote himself and his gimmick.
Absolutely, and it changed from town to town. You always had to know the right thing to say in the right place at the right time. You couldn't just go out there and give a pattern speech every day, or you wouldn't get very far in the wrestling business in the territory days.
No.
So, speaking of people who deserve some credit, it's it's unfortunate that Paul Boesch hasn't been nominated into the WWE Hall of Fame yet, and they've gone out there and done it for other promoters that Vince has bought out or crowded out of the wrestling business. And even Jim Ross has said that Boesch deserves that recognition as one of the greatest promoters in the business, right up there with the Gagnes and the Crockett's. So what do you have to say about that?
I agree with Jim Ross, and I enjoyed working with Jim Ross, but watching my uncle, and you see, my uncle actually wrestled for Vince McMahon's grandfather. So he has a long history in being grown up there in Long Beach, New York, and wrestling in the Northeast and the New York territory back in the early 30s. I'm not quite sure why he has not gotten the recognition from the WWE, because at one time we were even partners with Vince McMahon, and we got along fine with him. And Paul knew Vince's dad, he knew Vince's grandfather, and not only you put politics aside when it comes to things like the Hall of Fame. In my opinion, you put politics aside, and then you take a look, what was their contribution to the business? And when you look at Paul Boesch, 55 years, traveling around the world, and as a wrestler, and as a goodwill ambassador, as a promoter, and then you see what good he did as a wrestling promoter in the city of Houston, and not only just be having one of the top-rated television shows, but the way he went out of his way to help the youth and the disadvantaged, and other worthwhile causes through the years he and I both worked on. I think it is a shame that it's not recognized. But then again, I'm not quite sure why he hasn't gotten the recognition from the WWE. I strongly think that he does deserve it, and hopefully someday he will get it.
Yeah, well, at least in the meantime, he's in the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame as of 2005, and he's a charter member of the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame going back to 1996. So even if the WWE doesn't recognize it, there are a lot of people out there who know just how much Paul Boesch did for wrestling and for Houston.
Right.
Yeah, and one thing that I've learned in the course of doing my research for this book is that Boesch was an author of books himself. He wrote several books and even a book of poetry. That caught me by surprise.
He took pride in that. My uncle he did write about his war experiences in World War II, and he was also proud of the fact that he was the most decorated professional wrestler in World War II. He was awarded 2 silver stars, 2 bronze stars, and various other medals for his bravery. And he wrote about those war experiences. He also took a special interest in trying to help women protect themselves. And he even wrote a book called The Woman, the Art of Self-Defense, and Lady, Protect Yourself. And what he did in those books was he tried to point out common sense things for women to, when they leave a store, to make sure they already had their keys in their hands, that they wouldn't stand in the parking lot fumbling through a purse and leaving themselves vulnerable for someone to come up behind them and so forth. And interesting enough, the pictures showing how to defend themselves, the models for those pictures was Irish Danny McShane and his wife Sally. They posed the pictures on what a woman can do to help try to defend herself against an attack. But in the poetry book, and then these are all things that he felt part of this giving back to the community, and that was something that was instilled in me and also territorial promoters. You gave back to the community. Morris Siegel, as you read in the book, nearly 50 years of promoting in a market. Now think about that. How good a promoter you have to be, and what kind of relationship you have to have with the community to be successful for 50 years. That's a tremendous feat. And I think that was instilled in me and other territorial promoters. You give back to the community, and of course Paul Boesch was a prime example of that.
Yeah, and there are very few promotions in the wrestling business that had lasted 50 years or gone on beyond that from one promoter to the next generation of promoters. I think, other than maybe AAA in Mexico, Houston Wrestling might be one of the few that had such a long span.
And I think that was due to the fact that, number one, it was a good promoter, whether it was Morris Siegel or Paul Boesch, or later on when Paul Boesch and I teamed up with Nick Bockwinkel and Bill Watts and so forth. And I think the wrestling talent, but I think the key ingredient is just giving back to the community, this relationship. You give back to the community gives their support to you. And I think it's a wonderful formula.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away too much at the end of the book because, like you said, with the Wrestling Bear, we want people to buy the book and read the full story. But you do talk a little bit about Bockwinkel in the book and how, that was like at the time when things were just finally coming to an end and the territory days were dying. So when you look back on that now and you see what WWF has become, the WWE, the entertainment conglomerate, and we're just a couple days away from WrestleMania, you got to look back and kind of be in a little bit of awe that, this is how it all went down. And there was that chance for a little bit that these wrestling territories could hang on, but Vince just found a way to crowd everybody out of the market.
Well, and I thought that was a good example. The story of Houston Wrestling, I think, gave an example of what regional promotions were doing in the later days, in the final days of the regional promotions, how we were positioning ourselves, jockeying ourselves, new alliances were being made, new associations, new structures of promotions. But, looking back at it, it was inevitable. It was inevitable that if Vince McMahon didn't do it with the WWF, somebody else would have had done the same thing. The business was setting itself up for an evolutionary change, and that's why I think what's so unique about this book, When Wrestling Was Rasslin', I think readers will get an idea of what it was like in the last few days. Is sort of like being on the Titanic. We knew that our days of promoting were coming to an end. We knew that the new wave was coming in, and spearheaded by Vince McMahon Jr. and the WWF at that time. But at the same time, we loved what we were doing, and we did the best we could to last as long as we could.
I think that's a great analogy, actually, because it is like going to see the movie Titanic. You know how it's going to end. You know that Houston Wrestling is going to die, but you still want to see the story. You still want to follow all the players in the film, and just like that, you want to find out who was involved at the time, and this book tells all those stories, and you get to see the ship go down. And even though it's a shame that it did, you get to witness it firsthand through this book.
Well, and also I'm glad that Houston Wrestling, we were able to finish it the way we did. It was we were able to finish it as best as possible. Again, it was a class act by Vince McMahon to give Paul Bosch his final curtain call when we had a huge extravaganza. But again, let's let the readers read all about it. And then in my connection as well, being back into the wrestling promotion after that with Jim Crockett and NWA, and yet still be in a position that I was able to leave with our head held up high, and knowing that we gave fans their money's worth.
Absolutely so. And this book gives fans their money's worth too. When Wrestling Was Rasslin', it's available in bookstores. It's through Amazon.com, and the Wrestling Was Rasslin' website too. You can find it there and read excerpts and see photos from the history of Houston wrestling. But before we wrap it up, I got to ask my co-host Peter if he has any more questions for you, Peter Birkholz. So, Peter, the floor is yours if you have any more questions.
No, this is one of those interviews where I can just sit under the learning tree and listen for hours,
I wish we did have hours. It's unfortunate that we've got to start wrapping it up, but I know there's other interviews to do and other things that are going on this week and this weekend, but we do appreciate how generous Mr. Birkholz has been with his time. And my last question before we let you go tonight is going to be simply, when you look back now, do you have any regrets? Is there anything that you wish you could have done that you didn't get a chance to do back in the day?
I think I would have taken a little more time to smell the roses. Steve, you're involved in entertainment now, and the schedule gets a little bit hectic and stressful sometimes. But let me encourage you, young guys, smell the roses. I think back then I was so worried about ticket sales, the television ratings, so focused on the business that to sit back and to enjoy it a little bit more. But at the same time, had a great run and in a great wrestling promotion, had a great time in professional wrestling business. So overall, no regrets whatsoever. Nothing but fond memories.
Well, that's good. And people can see all those fond memories. And When Wrestling Was Rasslin', it's a tremendous book, and I want everybody to go out and get it. And Mr. Birkholz, thank you so much for your time. And hopefully we'll actually get to have you back on when we have a little more time, and we can get even further lessons under the learning tree. How does that sound?
I would love to do that. I enjoy talking to y'all.
All right. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your time. You have a great night and hopefully a great weekend to come.
You too. Thank you so much.